So now we're going to start playing with taking our Python applications and changing the source of their data. Up till now we've been reading files, the mailbox file, the Romeo file, but often a lot of what you need to do is look at data that's coming in from the internet. And so we're going to look at how we write Python programs to talk to the internet. And what we're going to do is we're going to play with the request-response cycle that your browser does. So your browser, when you're clicking on pages or watching this, is talking across the internet to servers. And we're going to take a look at the protocols and all the kinds of things that are happening. And your browser displays web pages and runs JavaScript and does this, that, and the other thing. And then it sends commands across the internet to these servers. And the servers run server languages like PHP or MySQL and send stuff back. And so we're going to spend our time in this section sort of learning about this area, what's going on back and forth as your web browser is talking to the internet. And then what we're going to do is we're going to write a Python program over here. And our Python program is going to talk the same protocol as your web browser, and we're going to do this to read information so that we can read information across the internet. Now I'm going to talk really quickly through some of what the internet is. That is a whole class. I wrote a whole book called Introduction to Networking that talks all about these kinds of things. And if you need more detail, then go ahead and get your hold of that book. There's also a free copy online of this book. And I also teach another Coursera class, Internet History, Technology, and Security, that goes into much more detail than this lecture. And so if you're interested in that, you can stop and go take that class right now in its entirety and then come back. But now this is the short version. The too long don't read. This is a picture of the network architecture, the TCP/IP, Transport Control Protocol. And it's this layered architecture. And these two ends, this is the your computer and this is the server's computer. And the data sort of works its way through various elements of your computer, walks across the network, and then takes multiple hops, actually many hops, as it goes across, and then finally makes it into the destination computer. And then the data that you're getting from that computer sort of walks its way back through all these hops, walk back, and then the application. And so this is your web browser, and this is the web server over here. And again, I teach class upon class about this, and you can go take all those classes. And so there's lots of detail that we're not going to cover. There is a layer that is the first end-to-end layer. We call it the transport layer, where your web browser on this end and the web server on this end in effect makes a connection and doesn't worry about all this detail, kind of ignores all this detail. Says, I'm going to talk to this endpoint, and then gets its data back, and then the data comes back. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is this peer-to-peer transport layer, the way that effectively computer applications make telephone calls from one application to the other. And so there's a lot of cool stuff that happens, and like I said, I wrote a whole book on this stuff, and you're welcome to go look at all that. But first we're going to really focus on how this works inside of Python. So a socket can be best thought of as a connection that we don't worry too much about. When you make a phone call and you start talking to somebody on the phone, you don't worry about the magic that gets this phone talking to the cell tower or anything like that. You just say, I need to connect to a person, and then once the connection's made, you do your talking. And applications inside of computers do the same thing. And we call this abstraction, this concept, a socket. A socket is two computer applications or computer processes that are talking across a network. And they sort of have this one endpoint, one puts stuff in and pulls stuff back out. And then there's all this magic that happens in the middle. And it's really complex. And then the other's getting stuff out and putting stuff back in. And so the socket is sort of like this abstraction that gives us like a phone call between two applications. In the beginning, this will be like a web server. And this is the code that you're going to write. This is our code. But socket is the way that it talks. Now we're doing something similar when we talk about files. So your code runs here, and if you remember, we had a file handle, and there's a disk drive out here that has data on it, and we'd use an open call, and we'd read stuff back and forth. So that was our way of saying a file handle is a way to look at a file and get stuff from it. A socket is a way to look at connection to another process on the end of it and then get data back. So both of these are like portholes that allow us to look out of our application to somewhere else in the world and exchange data with that. And so when you're making a connection, different applications, like there's applications like email and the web is the application we're going to play with, but these applications can all run on the same server. And so these applications have what's called a port number. And each port is a way to say, you know what, I want to talk to the web server on this host, or I want to talk to the email server on this host, or I want to talk to the network news server on this host, et cetera, et cetera. And so these are like extensions within phone numbers. And so if you have one big server, and it has the ability to do email, there's an email server application. This side here is the server now, and this is our client, like a browser. Well, this is not a browser, this is a browser, that's a browser. So the client is the thing initiating the connection, the server is the thing reacting to it. And the way they find each other is through these port numbers. So there would be a mail application, an application to do login, a web server, or a personal mailbox. And these things connect themselves to various ports and say, I will listen for connections to come in. And then when your web browser starts up and it wants to make a connection to the web server at University of Michigan, it makes a connection to port 80, and port 80 is then routed to the web server. The web server reads data somewhere and then gives us the stuff back. Okay? And so there is this thing called the IP address, which is like the phone number of the destination computer, and it's equivalent to the domain name address. Remember, there's a whole class that explains this if you... And it turns out that this isn't all that essential once we start programming. I just kind of want to give you a sense of what's going on. And so there is a domain name address that turns into an IP address that's the real address of the computer. And then within that, there's like this extension that says, I'm going to talk to the web server. And you could, using different numbers, port 80 turns out to be the one we'll use the most, and it's the way that you talk to the web server. So you talk to a host on the internet and then talk within that host to a particular piece of software. Okay. So some of the common TCP ports, HTTP, which is the web server, the secure web server is port 443, mail's on 25, secure login is on 22. And so every time someone builds a new application protocol, they come up with a new port for it. And then all the clients that want to talk to that protocol know what port to talk to. Sometimes you'll use a web browser and you will see a colon after the end of the host name, and that's what's happening when a web server is running on a port other than port 80. So this happens to be a development situation where I'm actually running on localhost, which is, if I was doing software web development on my computer, I would talk to localhost, which is talking to myself, and then on port 8085. Just means that it's a port other than port 80. So these are the normal ports, like 80 is the normal web port, but it doesn't have to be port 80. Okay, with all that, that's a lot of like blah, 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 blah. Now we're going to talk about how it happens in Python. And the beauty of this is there's a really nice library in Python called socket library, that we import a socket. So we say import socket. That makes available to us a whole bunch of library code that allows us to make sockets. And then this is kind of like fopen. It's like open, right? When we're doing file handles, right? If you think about our application as having these portholes that allow us to talk to disk drives or allow us to talk to the network. This is our way of opening a porthole out through the network. And so we say socket.socket. It's a little bit of a weird syntax. This is the library, and this is the method within the library. So that says make a socket, which basically says open me a porthole outside of my computer. And these next two parameters, you'll probably never change them, but what they really say is this says I'm going to make an internet socket, and it's a stream socket. A stream socket means that I'm just going to send data, and I'm going to get back the data and just keep track of the data. Give it back to me in order. There are ways to use it at a lower level where you're not giving it back in order, but these two things, you just are going to put those things in. Now this actually has not connected the socket. So we have our application. The socket effectively opens a porthole to the outside world, and there is nothing connected to the other side. And we get back this variable mysock, kind of like file open. It's almost like you say, I'm going to open a file, but I don't want to tell you what the name of the file is until later. But here is where we do. When we take this thing we get back from socket and it says, please connect, please establish a connection between me and go across the internet and find the host www.py4inf.com. That's a host. and then go to port 80 on that. So the second thing is the port. So we're saying, so we start the socket, and then we effectively say, dear socket, I want the other end of you to be this server with that address over there. And so at that point, if there is a server connected, a web server connected, then we can actually send data back and forth. So that is the number of lines to establish a connection between our running Python program and a server on an application running on the far end. You can't just connect to anywhere or anything. There has to be running software ready for you, waiting for your connection to show up. But that's the only 3 lines of Python. And so it's a good example of how something extremely complex that took 40 years to develop, the internet, and now in Python we do a single import statement of import socket, and then magically we can code over top of it without knowing of any of the details whatsoever. And of course that's what this XKCD of import anti-gravity is talking about. So the next thing I want to do is talk about moving from making a socket connection to actually solving a problem. So sockets are like making a phone call, and applications are what you say and expect to hear on those phone calls.